Hello, and welcome to We Speak CVE, a free podcast from the CVE program. On this podcast, we'll talk with people from the cybersecurity community about what else, cybersecurity and vulnerability management, and the CVE catalog of vulnerabilities. If you didn't know, the CVE program's mission is to identify, define, and catalog publicly disclosed cybersecurity vulnerabilities.
Hey, how's it going? My name is Todd Beardsley. I am a member of the CVE board here, and I'm joined by two other board members. Folks, why don't you introduce yourselves, starting with Shannon?
Hi, I'm Shannon Sabins, and I am, as Todd said, also a member of the CVE board, and I am also the co-chair of the Outreach Working Group for CVE.
Kent?
I am Kent Landfield, one of the founding board members of CVE back in 1999, and the chair of the Strategic Planning Working Group.
Well, that's amazing. I think today is the first day I learned that you were part of it and back in 1999. I had no idea. Well, hey, so today you may be wondering why I've asked you here today, and I'll tell you. We are going to spend a couple episodes talking about CVE myths, and we're hoping to maybe give some clarity out to the folks in the world who are affected by CVE, either as users or as implementers or whatever. And what is the CVE program today and here in sunny 2021, as opposed to how it used to be. But I think in order to get into those details and into those like particular myths, I think Kent, you are a ideal candidate to give us a little bit of a walking tour of where we've been over the last 20 something years. So CVE is not a static program, and I think what you were in the best position, I think, to illustrate that point.
Oh, thanks, Todd. Yeah, CVE has had quite a journey over the last 22 years. It has morphed in multiple ways, both from the limited format that only gave us 10,000 CVEs a year to what we have today, which is really unlimited. It started off with a small group of folks who were very, very active. We created candidate CVEs. They were called CANs, and they had to be validated by the program. So the individual board members actually did the evaluation to see if it was in fact a vulnerability. It was quickly realized that didn't scale really well. Voting on every single CVE and testing it was just not something we had the capability for. But through the years, CVE as a program has adjusted and evolved to address the expanding vulnerability landscape. In 2016, we had what I would call a sort of a revelation coming out, so to speak, from a standpoint of really understanding that we had to change as a program. We created a federated environment that didn't exist before. It was very flat. We had what was at the time one root within the program who was issuing all the CVE descriptions. We had a lot of things that we needed to change, and we did. And in doing so, we've created a very flexible team of folks on the CVE board who are contributing to the program's advancement. The board now is the guiding factor for the program. This is now a community effort. It was originally comprised of a lot of different vendors. That's changed as well. We have a user community, we have vendors, we have open source projects, we have a great diversity of folks on the board to bring their voices and their ideas to how to improve the program for their uses. So I'll leave it at that at this point, and Todd, if you have any other questions.
Yeah, for sure. So you would say, and in fact, I think I'll throw to Shannon here. Like, So myth number one, right? The CVE program is run entirely by the MITRE Corporation. That is absolutely not true. Would you agree with that, Shannon?
I've heard that before, and I was flabbergasted. So MITRE is the secretariat, but the board runs the program, and I think of MITRE as there to support and enable what we decide and what we want to do directionally, which they do an absolutely fantastic job, and are tremendously appreciated by the board. But I was flabbergasted to learn that that was a perception that's out there. The board runs the program. The board makes all the programmatic decisions. MITRE enables those decisions with us.
Yeah, for sure. And they don't have like, well, okay. I mean, like, let's just address it right away, right? Does we have a board, and that's great. We have a bunch of working groups where a lot of the work is actually done, which has a whole bunch of other people on them. But does MITRE have like special power and special pull these days in the CVE program? If MITRE decided to do something crazy, right, something radical with the CVE program, does that just pass through? I guess I'm just trying to find out from you, Kent, how much of a puppet is the board of the MITRE Corporation?
Well, there was a time when that was the case, when MITRE did run the entire program, but that had changed in 2016, as I mentioned earlier, rather dramatically. The board is really in charge of the program at this point, and MITRE understands they're a secretariat. They're actually providing services to the program. This is a community effort now, and it truly is a community effort, which is something that it took us a while to get to, but it's really been positive ever since. And the support we've gotten from the Secretariat has been fabulous and really outstanding. So this was something that was sort of a monumental change for the program. And it was good to have that happen.
Yeah. And so, like, I guess in that vein, right, there is no like one organization or person, really. It's not like a cult of personality or anything that is directing CVE, right? Like it is, as far as I can tell, truly like a community effort. I mean, I'm aware of other boards out in the world for other organizations. That's really just kind of an in club of people who are fairly monolithic, right? Kent, would you say that the decision-making process that goes on in board meetings or down in the working groups, would you say that feels more monolithic, or is there more spirited debate?
In my strategic planning working group, there's a lot of spirited debate. We take on the tough issues, and no one has limited their opinions or held back at any time if they disagreed. No, this is truly a consensus process, and we are working very hard to assure that we get consensus, or we continue working until we can. So there is no one, this is the way it's going to be kind of approach to things anymore. This is now truly a community consensus project.
Yeah. And I guess too, like, so let's go down that road a little more, right? The CVE program is not controlled by like one organization. One thing I've heard off and on over the years, not so much lately, but let's just address it right now since this is a myth busting, myth exposing podcast, is that the CVE program is controlled by software vendors. Shannon, do you have any opinions on that?
Well, I totally do. So, the organization that I work for, my day job currently, is not a CNA. We're a security vendor. You and I, Todd, both come to the CVE program from backgrounds working with research. So you often might hear perceptions about large vendors running the program, and of course, we welcome more researcher involvement, but you and I are perfect examples of persons who've come from research orgs into the CVE program, right? So I think we are much more diverse than people realize. And certainly, as you mentioned, we have open source projects. We have persons who come, numerous persons who come from research backgrounds. We are definitely a more diverse program than that.
Yeah, and I think that's true for the last, especially for the last couple years. Microsoft definitely has a presence in the CVE program, but they're not calling the shots, right? Kent, I'm curious, like, how different is this today than it has been in the past? Like, how would someone come to the conclusion, do you think? Maybe straw man it a little bit, like, oh no, it's totally about the vendors and they bury things.
Well, initially, it was a group of vendors. The intent initially was to try to find a common identifier for, specifically at the time, IDS vendors, because what we were seeing were IDS vendors were all seeing the same event that was occurring, but we couldn't correlate it as the single common event. So we had incident response teams jumping left and right, seeing if these were different events that were occurring from different attacks. CVE ID allowed the vendors to incorporate that into their logging mechanisms so that they could identify that this was in fact the same event that's seen by multiple IDS vendors, or it was a different one, so they could take appropriate action. So initially it was based on vendors, and through the years we knew as a community that the vendors were helping, but they weren't the solution to the problem, and we needed to get other voices involved and other communities represented to actually improve the program to where we're getting to and where we are today.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I used to work at one of those IDS vendors, and it was a hassle. I still do work on some other projects where we have references, and I would say it's unusual today to have, some kind of security entry come in that doesn't have a CVE identifier associated with it these days. Of course, they still happen. The CVE program does not assign an ID to everything. And I think that's a fine way to get into our next kind of major topic. We've talked about the makeup of the CVE, like who actually is doing the work there to make the CVE program, accessible to, everybody, users included. But what does the CVE actually cover? What kinds of vulnerabilities are in, and what kinds of vulnerabilities are out? Kent, you want to take a run at this one, and I'll throw in my opinion as well.
Yeah, I can get it started. From the standpoint of CVE, we hoped very early on that we'd be able to cover, everything. This was the very beginning of CVE. After a few months, it was quite obvious this was going to be quite a task, and we didn't have the right structure to scale. So through the years, CVE has actually morphed in how it does its processes to try to accommodate more and more vulnerability identification. In 2016, we realized that we needed to federate, and that federation was very important because it allows for additional large numbers of CNAs, of CVE numbering authorities, to be able to be incorporated into the program. So this was a pretty big milestone for the program, and being able to sort of supercharge our ability to get CVE information that's needed to actually identify a vulnerability in the wild. So, through the years, this has been an evolving program, and as such, we're able to address a lot more today, and we're just at the beginning of the federation aspects. We're growing that and providing additional automation services, which should help quite a bit.
Yeah, for sure. Shannon, I'm curious what your thoughts are here, especially you coming more in from a security kind of research background. Do you have any thoughts on, like, what are the ins and outs on vulnerabilities as far as CVE is concerned?
As far as CVE is concerned, I think we do have to look at how approaching the problem may be in the best service of servicing those who utilize CVE. and all the different sort of roles and stakeholders that utilize CVE. Not everything scales, and there are some things that may be perhaps less useful to all the stakeholders than others. So, we kind of have to, like anything else, prioritize what makes sense for those utilizing the fruits of the program, if you will.
Mhm.
So, does a CVE for every cross-site scripting, website vulnerability make sense? Is that possible? Does that scale? Perhaps not, right?
And I would say too that there's a difference in kind there, if you wouldn't mind,
there's a difference
right?
in kind there, right?
So like a cross-site scripting vulnerability on my personal website, probably not going to be a
Right,
CVE.
exactly.
A persistent cross-site scripting vulnerability in Gmail, maybe.
Bingo. So what's useful? What's optimally useful to the community, and what's the best service to the community? We have to think about that, and make thoughtful considerations about that. And we are looking at additional areas for programmatic growth with regard to OT, IoT. Here we have real opportunities for useful growth, and we're reaching out in those directions, and we're reaching out for regional growth. These things may be more important and more useful than trying to cover every single possible vulnerability that's out there, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and the other aspect here that should be noted is that technology has advanced so quickly in the last 10 years that we're finding many additional sectors that are in need of being able to identify vulnerabilities. The healthcare device market's one, automotive's another. There are emerging technology areas where we're working to get CVE to be an active participant in those worlds as well.
Exactly, and that's something we're thinking about both, programmatically overall and in particular in the outreach committee.
Yeah, right. Like the organizations that become CVE numbering authorities, or CNAs, we say CNA, we throw around CNA a lot. We may have even mentioned it once or twice in the podcast, expanding it. That's not by accident. There are organizations that just kind of originate on their own. They say like, oh, yep, I would love to be a CNA. I know that I have vulnerabilities in the products that right, OC. I never know what the acronyms actually stand for. But with your role in outreach, right, like you are specifically targeting certain vendors in certain industries. Is that accurate to say?
Right. Jo, who's the co-chair of the outreach working group, does a lot of the outreach herself, but we as a group do look at where we want to reach out, and we're specifically thinking about how do we round out the program, in a way that's meaningful, both regionally and in terms of sector. How do we try to get the involvement that makes sense and is the information that people are going to find useful, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would say the Federation has actually allowed us to grow quite a bit. CVE in the early days was very US based. Now we have 31 countries participating, with 180 plus 182 organizations, I think at the last count, around the world that are participating. And that's a rapid growth that's all occurred since our move to Federation.
So what's interesting to me is that, with all the Federation and bringing in more people to CVE, a lot of times, like, we'll start going down conversational paths, right, where we are trying to decide what is and isn't a vulnerability. And what's interesting to me that if you read the CVE rules, which we'll have a link in the show notes, the assignment rules there, I believe it's the first rule, says that if a vendor says that something is a vulnerability, it's a vulnerability. So that gives, I think, the CVE program like a lot of leeway, right, of how to define vulnerabilities, what's in and what's out, all with the input of the CVE community. I mean, like you say, Kent, like there's 180 plus, probably 200 by the end of the year, participants in the CVE program, and as we grow and expand, I have to believe that like our definitions of like what is and is not like an identifiable vulnerability will also expand. But that also brings me to severity, which Shannon touched on a couple times. Like, is CVE in the business of assigning severity, or risk, or a threat level, maybe, or whatever other kind of words you want to use in there, to these identified vulnerabilities? Kent.
So you're asking, is CVE a scoring system?
I am asking that.
Okay, well, CVE is not a scoring system. There is CVSS, which is used quite extensively. It was the original means for scoring. It's not associated with CVE at all, even though they use the individual records and score those records themselves. This was something developed by first.org. And the organization is now at version 3.1 of CVSS, and they continue to develop scoring mechanisms, enhancing CVSS. Additionally, it should be noted that there are other scoring systems out there that are emerging, that are they're showing promise. One is SSVC, which is a Carnegie Mellon CERT-CC effort that you'll be hearing about more in the not too distant future. That is more decision-based attributes, which is useful in trying to localize what is critical to your organization. The other is EPSS, and I think it's Exploit Prediction Scoring System. That is a scoring system that looks at utilizing artificial intelligence to try to predict whether a specific vulnerability has the potential to be exploited within the next 12 months. So scoring systems exist, and some of them are gaining, some new ones are emerging that are gaining steam. CVSS is the one that has been there from pretty much not too long after CVE. It was needed to prioritize in some respects, but CVE is not really associated with the CVSS scores, although the identifiers of the vulnerability, the vendors, the open source projects, whoever, quite often will incorporate the CVSS score that they have calculated for their vulnerability before it goes into the CVSS corpus, which then goes to NIST, who, for all intent and purposes, has been creating the base scores for years and years and years for all of the CVEs that come through.
Right. Yeah. And NIST, like, I think it's important to note, right, that NIST is not CVE. There's definitely some crossover there. We have at least one board member I can think of that spends a lot of time in NIST. But NIST, while NIST does do some of that initial scoring, that's not required for CVE. I know that like the CVE, like the JSON format, that is the data of a given CVE ID. It has a space for scoring, but it's definitely not required, and it's not. And so as a result, like you will see plenty of CVEs that like don't have that tag into them. That may change in the future, right? Like who knows what the unknowable future holds. But as of today, as far as I know, that's not scoring relative, awfulness on given vulnerabilities is not what CVE is about. CVE gives people some tools to do that, but that's not something that we provide.
We don't have a scoring system. We don't know CVSS, right?
Correct. Cool. Well, hey, I think that's honestly kind of all I have prepared for today. But Shannon or Kent, feel free to jump in if there's any kind of closing remarks you have for at least this episode. And I know we have not touched a bunch of other things, but for at least this episode, if you have anything else to add, lay it on me.
Well, I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of good ground. I mean, there are some myths out there about the program where we've had issues. We've worked hard to address those issues and to federate the program, to get more work done, to increase involvement, to increase scope, both in terms of sector and regionality, and to broadly increase participation, so that we can continue to do more as the space grows. So we are certainly a dynamic organization, and we are happy to address places where we may have fallen short. We're working hard to do that.
Yeah, I would agree. The term dynamic, I think, is much more appropriate over the last few years than it was at any point in the past of the CVE's 22-year history. The program is absolutely moving forward, moving on, and trying to address the issues that we've had in the past, as Shannon mentioned. But there's a lot of new capabilities that we're bringing to fold in the very short term that you'll be seeing and hearing from. I would pay attention to the changes that are occurring because they may affect you downstream in a positive way, and taking advantage of them could be beneficial to your organization. But in any case, this is a positive program with a lot of positive people trying really hard to make sure that they can make a difference in the vulnerability management and vulnerability identification fields. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Plus one to that, it's amazing to me like how passionate the people are who are involved in CVE. So if this sounds like a group you'd like to hang out with a lot, come on over to the CVE website. If you just Google CVE CNA, you'll find it. And you too can sign up to become a CVE numbering authority. And with that, I'll leave you be. Come back next time for more myths that we will address and bust and do all those things that one does with myths. Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Shannon and Kent, for coming on today.
Thank you for joining us today on the We Speak CVE podcast, which is available for free on Buzzsprout and the CVE website. If you'd like to participate or suggest a topic, please contact us on the CVE website.